So I don't know if you recall from yesterday, I played a record called "The Soul of Spain," and I wasn't sure what year it was from because I couldn't find a copyright date on the album. I looked it up afterwards, and it looks like it's from 1958. This record that I'm going to play today looks like, well, it's from the same label, and they are just as proud of their stereo fidelity as "The Soul of Spain" was. This also doesn't have a date on it, but just because it has a lot of the same markings on the back, I assume it's of the same vintage. So we have uh, Tchaikovsky Concerto for Violin in D major, Opus 35. It is Georgy Pauk, soloist, Gunnar Stern conducting, the London Philharmonic Orchestra. Um, so I noticed it has this as advertised in life thing here. I don't know if you guys can see that at all or make it out. But the price on it is $298, which I looked up on an inflation calculator. And if this record is indeed from the late 50s, $2.98 is the equivalent of $27 today. That's a pretty hefty price to have paid for this record. Looks like whoever acquired it later only paid 99 cents for it. Although I guess that could be $99. Maybe it appreciated in value. Who knows? But yes, here we go. So we're going to listen to some Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto in D major, Opus 35, and carry on with Star Wars. So let's get into that. Cheers. We were just at the beginning of Chapter 7 yesterday. I read the first two paragraphs of it before their break. So we're going to pick up right there. From their vantage point in another booth, Solo and Chewbacca watched as the Imperials strode through the bar. Two of them gave the Corellian a lingering glance. Chewbacca growled once, and the two soldiers hurried their pace somewhat. Solo grinned sardonically, turning to his partner. Chewie, this charter could save our necks. 17,000! He shook his head in amazement. Those two must be really desperate. I wonder what they're wanted for. But I agreed, no questions. They're paying enough for it. Let's get going. The Falcon won't check itself out. Going somewhere, Solo? The Corellian couldn't identify the voice, coming as it did through an electronic translator. But there was no problem recognizing the speaker or the gun. It had stuck in Solo's side. The creature was roughly man-sized and bipedal, but its head was something out of a delirium by way of an upset stomach. It had huge, dull-faceted eyes, bulbous on a pea-green face. A ridge of short spines crested the high skull, while nostrils and mouth were contained in a taperal snout. As a matter of fact, Solo replied slowly, I was just on my way to see your boss. You can tell Jabba I've got the money I owe him. That's what you said yesterday, and last week, and the week prior to that. It's too late, Solo. I'm not going to go back to Jabba with another one of your stories. But I've really got the money this time, Solo protested. Fine, I'll take it now, please. Solo sat down slowly. Jabba's minions were apt to be cursed with nervous trigger fingers. The alien took the seat across from him, the muzzle of the ugly little pistol never straying from Solo's chest. I haven't got it here with me. Tell Jabba it's too late, I think. Jabba would rather have your ship. Over my dead body, Solo said amiably. The alien was not impressed. If you insist, will you come with me outside, or must I finish it here? I don't think they'd like another killing in here, Solo pointed out. Something which might have been a laugh came from the creature's translator. They'd hardly notice. Get up, Solo. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. You've embarrassed me in front of Jabba with your pious excuses for the last time. I think you're right. Light and noise filled the little corner of the cantina, and when it had faded, all that remained of the alien was a smoking, slimy spot on the stone floor. Guess it leaves no question of who shot first. Solo brought his hand in the smoking weapon it held out from underneath the table, drawing bemused stares from several of the cantina's patrons and clucking sounds from its more knowledgeable ones. They had known the creature had committed its fatal mistake in allowing Solo the chance to get his hands under cover. It'll take a lot more than the likes of you to finish me off. Jabba the Hutt always did skimp when it came to hiring his hands. Leaving the booth, Solo flipped the bartender a handful of coins as he and Chewbacca moved off. Sorry for the mess. I was sorry for the mess. I always was rotten host. A rotten host. Excuse me for a moment. Heavily armed troopers hurried down the narrow alleyway, glowing from time to time at the dankly clad beings who hawked exotic goods from dingy little stalls. Here in Mos Eisley's inner regions, the walls were high and narrow, turning the passageway into a tunnel. No one stared angrily back at them. No one shouted imprecations or mouthed obscenities. Their armored figures moved with the authority of the Empire, their sidearms boldly displayed and activated. All around, men, not men, and mechanicals were crouched in waste-littered doorways. Among accumulations of garbage and filth, they exchanged information and concluded transactions of dubious legality. A hot wind moaned down the hallway. A hot wind moaned down the alleyway, and the troopers closed their formation. Their precision and order masked a fear of such claustrophobic quarters. One paused to check a door, only to discover it tightly locked and bolted. A sand-encrusted human shambling nearby visited a half-mad harangue on the trooper. Shrugging inwardly, the soldier gave the crazy human a sour eye before moving on down the alley to join up with his fellows. As soon as they were all past, the door slid open a crack, and a metallic face peered out. Below 3PO's leg, a squat barrel shape struggled for a view.
I would rather have gone with Master Luke than stay here with you. Still, orders are orders. I don't quite know what all this trouble is about, but I'm sure it must be your fault.
R2 responded with a near impossibility, a sniggering beep.
You watch your language,
the taller machine warned. The number of old Landspeeders and other powered transports in the dusty lot which were still capable of motion could be counted on the fingers of one hand, but that was not the concern of Luke and Ben as they stood bargaining with the tall, slightly insectoid owner. They were not to buy, but to sell. None of the passers-by favored the hagglers with so much a curious glance. Similar transactions, which were the business of no one but the transactors, took place 600 times daily in Mos Eisley. Eventually, there were no more pleas or threats to be exchanged. As though doling out vials of his own blood, the owner finalized the sale by passing a number of small metal shapes to Luke. Luke and the insectoid traded formal goodbyes, and then they parted, each convinced he had gotten the better of the deal. He says it's the best he can do. Since the XP-38 came out, these just aren't in demand anymore, Luke sighed. Don't look so discouraged, Kenobi chided him. What you've obtained will be sufficient. I have enough to cover the rest. Leaving the main street, they turned down the alleyway and walked past a small robot herding along a clutch of creatures resembling attenuated anteaters. As they rounded the corner, Luke strained for a forlorn glimpse of the old Landspeeder, his last link with his former life. Then there was no more time for looking back. Something short and dark that might have been human underneath all its wrappings stepped out of the shadows as they moved away from the corner. It continued staring after them as they disappeared down a bend in the walkway. The docking bay entrance to the small saucer-shaped spacecraft was completely ringed by a half-dozen men and aliens, which the former were by half the most grotesque. A great mobile tub of muscle and sweat topped by a shaggy, scarred skull surveyed the semicircle of armed assassins with satisfaction. Moving forward from the center of the crescent, he shouted toward the ship, "Come out, Solo. We've got you surrounded." If so, you're facing the wrong way, came a calm voice. Jabba the Hutt jumped, in itself a remarkable sight. His black eyes likewise whirled to see Han Solo and Chewbacca standing behind them. You see, I've been waiting for you, Jabba. I expected you would be, the Hutt admitted, at once pleased and alarmed by the fact that neither Solo nor the Wookiee appeared to be armed. I'm not that type of man, Solo said. Run? Run from what? Jabba countered. The absence of visible weapons bothered Jabba more than he cared to admit to himself. There was something peculiar here, and it would be better to make no hasty moves until he discovered what was amiss. Han, my boy, there are times when you disappoint me. I merely wish to know why you haven't paid me, as you should have long ago. And why did you have to fry poor Greedo like that? After all, you and I have been through a lot together. Solo grinned tightly. Shove it, Jabba. There isn't enough sentiment in your body to warm an orphaned bacterium. As for Greedo, you sent him to kill me. Why, Han, Jabba protested in surprise. Why would I do that? You're the best smuggler in the business. You're too valuable to fry. Greedo was only relaying my natural concern at your delays. He wasn't going to kill you. I think he thought he was. Next time, don't send one of those hired twerps. If you've got something to say, come and see me yourself. Jabba shook his head, and his jowls shook, lazy, fleshy echoes of his mock sorrow. Han, Han, if only you hadn't had to dump that shipment of spice. You understand, I just can't make an exception. Where would I be if every pilot who smuggled for me dumped his shipment at the first sign of an Imperial warship, and then simply showed empty pockets when I demanded recompensation? It's not good business. I can't be generous and forgiving, but not to the. I can be generous and forgiving, but not to the point of bankruptcy. You know, even I get bored sometimes, Jabba. Did you think I dumped that spice because I got tired of its smell? I wanted to deliver it just as much as you wanted to receive it. I had no choice. Again, the sardonic smile. As you say, I'm too valuable to fry, but I've got a charter now, and I can pay you back plus a little extra. I just need some more time. I can give you 1,000 on account. The rest in 3 weeks. The gross form seemed to consider, then directed his next words, not to Solo, but to his hirelings. Put your blasters away. His gaze, in a predatory smile, turned to the wary Corellian. Han, my boy, I'm only doing this because you're the best, and I'll need you again sometime. So, out of the greatness of my soul and a forgiving heart, and for an extra, say, 20%, I'll give you a little more time. The voice nearly cracked with restraint. But this is the last time. If you disappoint me again, if you trample my generosity in your mocking laughter, I'll put a price on your head so large you won't be able to go near a civilized system for the rest of your life. Because on every single one, your name and face will be known to men who'll gladly cut your guts out for 1/10 of what I'll promise them. Well, I'm glad we both have my best interests at heart, replied Solo pleasantly as he and Chewbacca started past the staring eyes of the Hutt's hired guns. Don't worry, Jabba. I'll pay you, but not because you threaten me. I'll pay you because it's my pleasure. They're starting to search the spaceport central, the commander declared, having to alternately run a couple of steps and then walk to keep pace with the long strides of Darth Vader. The Dark Lord was deep in thought as he strode down one of the battle station's main corridors, trailed by several aides. The reports are just starting to come in, the commander went on. It's only a matter of time before we have those droids.
Send in more men if you have to. Never mind the protests of the planetary governor. I must have those droids. It's her hope of the data being used against us that is a pillar of her resistance to the mind probes.
I understand, Lord Vader. Until then, we must waste our time with Governor Tarkin's foolish plan to break her. There's Docking Bay 94, Luke told Kenobi, and the robots who had rejoined them. And there's Chewbacca. He seems excited about something. Indeed, Indeed, the big Wookiee was waving over the heads of the crowd and jabbering loudly in their direction. Speeding their pace, none of the foursome noticed the small, dark-clad thing that had followed them from the transporter lot. The creature moved into the doorway and pulled a tiny transmitter from a pouch concealed in its multi-folded robes. The transmitter looked far too new and modern to be in the grasp of such a decrepit specimen, yet its manipulator was speaking into it with a steady assurance. Docking Bay 94, Luke noted, was no different in appearance from a host of other grandiosely named docking bays scattered throughout Mos Eisley. It consisted mostly of an entrance rampway and an enormous pit gouged from the rocky soil. This served as a clearance rail for the effects of the simple anti-grav drive, which boosted all spacecraft clear of the gravitational field of the planet. The mathematics of space drive were simple enough even to Luke. The anti-grav could operate only when there was sufficient gravity well to push against, like that of a planet, whereas superlight travel could only take place where a ship was clear of the same gravity, hence the necessity for the dual drive system on any extra system craft. The pit which formed Docking Bay 94 was as shabby cut and run down as the majority of Mos Eisley. Its sloping sides were crumbling in places instead of being smoothly fashioned as they were on more populous worlds. Luke felt it formed the perfect setting for the spacecraft Chewbacca was leading them toward. The battered ellipsoid, which could only loosely be labeled a ship, appeared to have been pieced together out of old hull fragments and components discarded as unusably by other craft. The wonder of it, Luke mused, was that the thing actually held its shape. Trying to picture this vehicle as spaceworthy would have caused him to collapse in hysteria, were the situation not so serious. But to think of traveling to Alderaan in this pathetic... What a piece of junk, he finally murmured, unable to hide his feelings any longer. They were walking up the rampway toward the open port. This thing couldn't possibly make it into hyperspace. Kenobi didn't comment, but merely gestured toward the port where a figure was coming to meet them. Either Solo had supernaturally acute hearing, or else he was used to the reaction at the sight of the Millenium Falcon by prospective passengers. She may not look like much, he confessed as he approached them, but she's all go. I've added a few unique modifications to her myself. In addition to piloting, I like to tinker. She'll make 0.5 factors beyond lightspeed. Luke scratched his head as he tried to reassess the craft in view of its owner's claims. Either the Corellian was the biggest liar this side of the galactic center, or there was more to this vessel than met the eye. Luke thought back once more to old Ben's admonition, never to trust surface impressions, and decided to reserve judgment on the ship and its pilot until he had watched them in operation. Chewbacca had lingered behind the docking bay entrance. Now he rushed up the ramp, a hairy whirlwind, and blabbered excitedly at Solo. The pilot regarded him coolly, nodding from time to time, then barked a brief reply. The Wookiee charged into the ship, pushing only to urge everyone to follow. We seem to be a bit rushed, Solo explained cryptically, so if you'll hurry aboard, we'll be off. Luke was about to venture some questions, but Kenobi was already prodding him up the ramp. The droids followed. Inside, Luke was slightly startled to see the bulky Chewbacca squirm and fight his way into a pilot's chair, which, despite modifications, was still overwhelmed by his massive form. The Wookiee flipped several tiny switches, and the digits seemingly too big for the task. Those great paws drifted with surprising grace over the controls. A deep throbbing started somewhere within the ship as the engines were activated. Luke and Ben began strapping themselves into the vacant seats in the main passageway. Outside the docking bay entrance, a long, leathery snout protruded from dark folds of cloth. And somewhere in the depths, to either side of the imposing proboscis, eyes stared intently. They turned along with the rest of the head as a squad of 8 Imperial troops rushed up. Perhaps not surprisingly, they headed straight for the enigmatic figure, who whispered something to the lead trooper and gestured to the docking bay. The information must have been provocative. Activating their weapons and raising them to firing position, the troops charged en masse down the docking bay entrance. A glint of light on moving metal caught Solo's eyes as the unwelcome outlines of the first troops showed themselves. Solo thought it unlikely they would pause to engage in casual conversation. His suspicion was confirmed before he could open his mouth to protest their intrusion, as several dropped to their knees and opened fire on him. Solo ducked back inside, turning to yell forward, "Chewie, deflector shields! Quick, get us out of here!" A throaty roar of acknowledgement came back to him. Drawing his own pistol, Solo managed to snap off a couple of bursts from the compartment safety of the hatchway. Seeing that their quarry was neither helpless nor comatose, the exposed troops dove for cover. The low throbbing noise rose to a whine, then to a deafening howl as Solo's hand came down on the quick release button. Immediately, the overhead hatch cover slammed shut. As the retreating troops raced out of the docking bay entrance, the ground was trembling steadily. They ran smack into a second squad, which had just arrived in response to the rapidly spreading emergency call. One of the soldiers, gesticulating wildly, tried to explain to the newly arrived ranking officer what had happened in the back of the bay. Let's flip the record over and continue. As soon as the panting trooper had finished, the officer whipped out a compact communicator and shouted into it, "Flight deck, they're trying to escape. Send everything you've got after this ship." All across Mos Eisley, alarms began to sound, spreading out from Docking Bay 94 in concentric circles of concern. Several soldiers scouring one alleyway reacted to the citywide alarm, and at the time, as soon as they saw the small freighter lift gracefully into the clear blue sky above Mos Eisley, it shrank to a pinpoint before any of them thought to bring a weapon to bear. Luke and Ben were already undoing their acceleration straps as Solo walked past them, moving toward the cockpit with the easy, loose-limbed stride of the experienced race spacer. Once forward, he fell rather than sat into the pilot's seat and immediately began checking readouts and gauges. In the seat next to him, Chewbacca was growling and grunting like a poorly tuned speeder engine. He turned from studying his own instruments long enough to jab a massive finger at the tracking screen. Solo gave it a quick glance, then turned irritably to his own panel. I know. Looks like 2, maybe 3 destroyers. Somebody certainly dislikes our passengers. Sure picked ourselves a hot one this time. Try to hold them off somehow until I can finish the programming for the super light jump. Angle the deflectors for maximum shielding." With those instructions, he ceased conversing with the huge Wookiee as his hands flew over the computer input terminals. Solo did not even turn around when a small cylindrical shape appeared in the doorway behind him. R2-D2 beeped a few remarks, then scurried away. Rear scanners showed the baleful lemon eye of Tatooine shrinking rapidly behind them. It was rapid enough to eliminate the 3 points of light that indicated the presence of the pursuing Imperial warships. Although Solo had ignored R2, he turned to acknowledge the entrance of his human passengers. "We've got 2 more coming in from different angles," he told them, scrutinizing the remorseless instrumentation. "They're going to try to box us up before we can make the jump. 5 ships. What did you 2 do to attract that kind of company?" "Can't you outrun them?" Luke asked sarcastically, ignoring the pilot's question. "I thought you said this thing was fast." "Watch your mouth, kid, or you'll find yourself floating home. There's too many of them, for one thing, but we'll be safe enough once we've made the jump into hyperspace." He grinned knowingly. "Can't nobody track another ship accurately at super light speeds. Plus, I know a few tricks that ought to lose any persisting stick tight out. Sorry. Plus, I know a few tricks that ought to loose any persistent stick-tights. I wish I'd known you boys were so popular. Why? Luke said challengingly. Would you have refused to take us? Not necessarily, the Corellian replied, refusing to be baited. But I sure as hell would have boosted your fare. Luke had a retort poised on his lips. It was wiped out as he threw up his arms to ward off a brilliant red flash, which gave black space outside the viewport, the temporary aspect of the surface of the sun. Kenobi, Solo, and even Chewbacca did likewise, since the proximity of the explosion nearly overrode the phototropic shielding. Here's where the situation gets interesting, Solo muttered. How long before you can make the jump? Kenobi inquired, easily, apparently unconcerned that at any second they all might cease to exist. We're still within the gravitational influence of Tatooine, came the cool response. It'll be a few more minutes yet before we can get the navigation computer to compensate an effect for an accurate jump. I could override its decision, but the hyperdrive would likely shred itself. That would give me a nice hold full of scrap metal in addition to U4. A few minutes? Luke blurted out, staring at the screens. At the rate they're gaining? Traveling through hyperspace isn't like dusting crops, boy. Ever tried calculating a hyperspace jump? Luke had to shake his head. It's no mean trick. Be nice if we rushed to it and passed right through a star or some other friendly spatial phenomenon like a black hole. That would end our trip real quick. Fresh explosions continued to flare close by, despite Chewbacca's... Fresh explosions continued to flare close by, despite Chewbacca's best efforts at evasion. On Solo's console, a red warning light began to flash for attention. What's that? Luke wondered nervously. We're losing a deflector shield, Solo informed him with the air of a man about to have a tooth pulled. Better strap yourselves back in. We're almost ready to make the jump. It could get bad if we take a near burst at the wrong moment. Back in the main hold area, 3PO was already locked tightly into his seat by metal arms, stronger than the acceleration straps. R2 swayed back and forth under the concussion produced by increasingly powerful energy bursts against the ship's deflectors.
Was this trip really necessary?
The tall robot muttered in desperation.
I'd forgotten how much I hate space travel.
He broke off as Luke and Ben appeared and began strapping themselves back into their chairs. Oddly, Luke was thinking of a dog he had once owned when an immensely powerful something wrenched at the ship's hull with the strength of a fallen angel. Admiral Motti entered the quiet conference room, his face streaked by the linear lights lining the walls. His gaze went to the spot where Governor Tarkin stood before the curved viewing screen, and he bowed slightly. Despite the evidence of the small green gem of a world entered in the screen, he formally announced, "We have entered the Alderaan system. We await your order." The door signaled, and Tarkin made a falsely gentle gesture to the Admiral. "Wait a minute yet, Motti." The door slid aside, and Leia Organa entered, flanked by 2 armed guards, followed by Darth Vader. "I am," Tarkin began. "I know who you are," she spat. "Governor Tarkin. I should have expected to find you holding Vader's leash. I thought I recognized your unique stench when I was first brought on board." "Charming to the last," Tarkin declared in a fashion which suggested he was anything but charmed. "You don't know how hard I found to sign the order for your termination." His expression changed to one of mock sorrow. "Of course, had you cooperated in our investigation, things might be otherwise. Lord Vader has informed me that your resistance to our traditional methods of inquiry—" "Torture, you mean," she countered, a trifle shakily. "Let us not bandy semantics," Tarkin smiled. "I'm surprised you had the courage to take the responsibility for issuing the order yourself." Tarkin sighed reluctantly. "I'm a dedicated man, and the pleasures I reserve for myself are few. One of them is that before your execution, I should like you to be my guest at a small ceremony. It will certainly be this battle station's op- it will certify this battle station's operational status, while at the same time ushering in a new era of Imperial technical supremacy. This station is the final link in the new forged Imperial chain, which will bind the million systems of the Galactic Empire together once and for all. Your petty alliance will no longer be of any concern to us. After today's demonstration, no one will dare to oppose the Imperial decree, not even the Senate. Organa looked at him with contempt. Force will not keep the Empire together. Force has never kept anything together for very long. The more you tighten your grip, the more systems will slip through your fingers. You're a foolish man, Governor. Foolish men often choke to death on their own delusions. Tarkin smiled a death's head smile, his face a parchment skull's. It will be interesting to see what manner of passing Lord Vader has in mind for you. I am certain it will be worthy of you, and for him. But before you leave us, we must demonstrate the power of this station once and for all, in conclusive fashion. In a way, you have determined the choice of subject for this demonstration. Since you have proven reluctant to supply us with the location of the rebel stronghold, I have deemed it appropriate to select as an alternate subject your home planet of Alderaan. No, you can't. Alderaan is a peaceful world, with no standing armies. You can't. Tarkin's eyes gleamed. You would prefer another target? A military target, perhaps? We're agreeable. Name the system. He shrugged elaborately. I grow tired of such games. For the last time, where is the main rebel base? A voice announced over a hidden speaker that they had approached within anti-grav range of Alderaan, approximately 6 planetary diameters. That was enough to accomplish what all of Vader's infernal devices had failed to do. Dantooine, she whispered, staring at the deck, all pretense and at defiance gone now. They're on Dantooine. Tarkin let out a slow sigh of satisfaction, then turned to the black figure nearby. There, you see, Lord Vader? She can be reasonable. One needs only frame the question properly to elicit the desired response. He directed his attention to the other officers. After concluding our little test here, we shall make haste to move on to Dantooine. You may proceed with the operation, gentlemen. It took several seconds for Tarkin's words, so casually uttered, to penetrate. What? Organa finally gasped. Dantooine, Tarkin explained, examining his fingers, is too far from the centers of Imperial population to serve as the subject of an effective demonstration. You will understand that for reports of our power to spread rapidly through the Empire, we required in a world that is more centrally located. Have no fear, though. We will deal with your rebel friends on Dantooine as soon as possible. But you said, Organa started to protest. The only words which have meaning are the last ones spoken, Tarkin declared cuttingly. We will proceed with the demonstration of Alderaan as planned. Then you will enjoy watching with us its obliteration. Then you will enjoy watching with us as we obliterate Dantooine, center of this stupid and futile rebellion. He gestured to the 2 soldiers flanking her. Escort her to the principal observation level, and, he smiled, make sure she is provided with an unobstructed view. And thus concludes Chapter 7, and we continue on with Chapter 8. Solo is busily checking readouts from gauges and dials in the hold area. Occasionally, he would pass a small box across various sensors, study the result, and cluck with pleasure. You can stop worrying about your Imperial friends, he told Luke and Ben. They'll never be able to track us now. Told you I'd lose them. Kenobi might have nodded briefly in response, but he was engaged in explaining something to Luke. Don't everybody thank me at once. Solo grunted, slightly miffed. Anyway, navigation computer calculates our arrival in Alderaan orbit at 0200. I'm afraid after this little adventure, I'll have to forge a new registration. He returned to his checking. Passing in front of a small circular table, the top was covered with small squares lit from beneath, while computer monitors were set into each side. Tiny three-dimensional figures were projected above the tabletop from various squares. Chewbacca sat hunched over one side of the table, his chin resting in massive hands, his great eyes glowing and facial whiskers wrinkled upward. He gave every sign of being well pleased with oneself. At least he did until R2-D2 reached up with a stubby clawed limb across from him and tapped his own computer monitor. One of the figures walked abruptly across the board to a new square and stopped there. An expression of puzzlement, then anger, crossed the Wookiee's face as he studied a new configuration. Glaring up and over the table, he vented a stream of abusive gibberish on the inoffensive machine. R2 could only beep in reply, but 3PO soon interceded on behalf of his less eloquent companion and began arguing with the hulking anthropod.
He executed a fair move. Screaming about it won't help you.
Attracted by the commotion, Solo looked back over his shoulders and frowned slightly. Let him have it. Your friend's way ahead anyhow. It's not wise to upset a Wookiee.
I can sympathize with that opinion, sir,
3PO countered.
But there is principle at stake here. There are certain standards any sentient creature must hold to. If one compromises them for any reason, including intimidation, then one is abrogating his right to be called intelligent.
I hope you'll both remember that, Solo advised him, when Chewbacca is pulling the arms off you and your little friend.
Besides that, however,
3PO continued without missing a beat,
being greedy or taking advantage of someone in a weakened position is a clear sign of poor sportsmanship.
That elicited a beep of outrage from R2 and the two robots, who were soon engaged in a violent electronic argument, while Chewbacca continued jabbering at each in turn, occasionally waving at them through the translucent pieces, waiting patiently on the board. Oblivious to the altercation, Luke stood frozen in the middle of the hold. He held an activated lightsaber in position over his head. A low hum came from the ancient instrument, while Luke lunged and parried under Ben Kenobi's instructive gaze. As Solo glanced from time to time at Luke's awkward movements, his lean features were sprinkled with smugness. No, Luke, your cuts should flow, not be so choppy, Kenobi instructed him gently. Remember, the Force is omnipresent. It envelops you as it radiates from you. A Jedi warrior can actually feel the Force as a physical thing. It's an energy field, then? Luke inquired. It's an energy field and something more, Kenobi went on about mystically. An aura that at once controls and obeys. It is nothingness that can accomplish miracles. He looked thoughtful for a moment. Not one, not even the Jedi scientists, were able to truly define the Force. Possibly no one ever will. Sometimes there's as much magic as science in the explanations of the Force. Yet, what is a magician but a practicing theorist? Now, let's try again. The old man was hefting a silvery globe about the size of a man's fist. It was covered with fine antennae, some as delicate as those of a moth. He flipped it toward Luke and watched as it halted a couple meters away from the boy's face. Luke readied himself as the ball circled him slowly. Turning to face it, it assumed a new position. Abruptly, it executed a lightning-swift lunge, only to freeze about a meter away. Luke failed to succumb to the feint, and the ball soon backed off. I'm going to keep reading until the next break, which looks to be a few pages away. So I'm just going to back up on the record a little bit to give us a little more music. Moving slowly to one side in an effort to get around the ball's force sensors. Luke drew the saber back, preparatory to striking. As he did so, the ball darted in behind him. A thin pencil of red light jumped from one of the antennae on the back of Luke's thigh, knocking him to the deck, even as he was bringing his saber around. Far too late. Rubbing at his tingling, sleeping leg, Luke tried to ignore the burst of accusing laughter from Solo. Hocus-pocus religions and archaic weapons are no substitute for a good blaster at your side, the pilot sneered. You don't believe in the Force? Asked Luke, struggling back to his feet, the numbing effect of the beam having worn off quickly. I've been from one end of the galaxy to the other, the pilot boasted, and I've seen a lot of strange things. Too many to believe there couldn't be something like this Force. Too many to think there could be some such controlling one's actions. I determine my destiny, not some half-mystical energy field. He gestured toward Kenobi. I wouldn't follow him so blindly if I were you. He's a clever old man, full of simple tricks and mischief. He might be using you for his own ends. Kenobi only smiled gently, then turned back to face Luke. I suggest you try it again, Luke, he said soothingly. You must try to divorce your actions from conscious control. Try not to focus on anything concrete, visually or mentally. You must let your mind drift. Drift. Only then can you use the Force. You have to enter a state in which you act on what you sense, not on what you think beforehand. You must cease cognition, relax, stop thinking, let yourself drift. Free. Free. The old man's voice had dropped to a mesmerizing buzz. As he finished, the chrome bulb darted at Luke. Dazed by Kenobi's hypnotic tone, Luke didn't see its charge. It's doubtful he saw much of anything with clarity. But as the ball neared he whirled with amazing speed, the saber arcing up out in a peculiar fashion. The red beam the globe emitted was neatly deflected to one side. Its humming stopped, and the ball bounced to the deck, all animation gone. Blinking as if coming awake from a short nap, Luke stared in absolute astonishment at the inert remote. You see, you can do it, Kenobi told him. One can teach only so much. Now you must learn to admit the Force when you want it. You must learn to admit the Force when you want it, so that you can learn to control it consciously. Moving to one side, Kenobi took a large helmet from behind a locker and walked over to Luke, placing the helmet over his head, effectively eliminating the boy's vision. I can't see, Luke muttered, turning around and forcing Kenobi to step back out of range of the dangerously waving saber. How can I fight? With the Force, old Ben explained. You didn't really see the Seeker when it went for your legs last time, and yet you parried its beam. Try to let your sensation flow from within you again. I can't do it, Luke moaned. I'll get hit again. Not if you let yourself trust you, Kenobi insisted, none too convincingly for Luke. This is the only way to be certain you're relying wholly on the Force. Noticing that the skeptical Corellian had turned to watch, Kenobi hesitated momentarily. It did Luke no good to have the self-assured pilot laugh every time a mistake was made. But coddling the boy would do him no good either, and there was no time for it anyway. Throw him in and hope he floats, Ben instructed himself firmly. Bending over the chrome globe, he touched a control at its side. Then he tossed it straight up. It arched toward Luke, breaking in mid-fall. The ball plummeted stone-like toward the deck. Luke swung the saber at it. While it was a commendable try, it wasn't nearly fast enough. Once again, the little antenna glowed. This time, the crimson needle hit Luke square on the seat of his pants. Though it wasn't an incapacitating blow, it felt like one, and Luke let out a yelp of pain as he spun, trying to strike his invisible tormentor. Relax, old Ben urged him. Be free. You're trying to use your eyes and ears. Stop predicting and use the rest of your mind. Suddenly, the youth stopped, wavering slightly. The seeker was still behind him. Changing direction again, it made another dive and fired. Simultaneously, the lightsaber jerked around, as accurate as it was awkward in its motion, to deflect the bolt. This time, the ball didn't fall motionless to the deck. Instead, it backed up 3 meters and remained there, hovering. Aware that the drone of the seeker remote no longer assaulted his ears, a cautious Luke peeked out from under the helmet. Sweat and exhaustion competed for space on his face. I told you you could, Kenobi informed him with pleasure. Once you start to trust your inner self, there'll be no stopping you. I told you there was much of your father in you. I'd call it luck, snorted Solo as he concluded his examination of the readouts. In my experience, there's no such thing as luck, my young friend. Only favorable adjustments of multiple factors to incline events in your favor. Call it what you like, the Corellian sniffed indifferently. But good against a mechanical remote is one thing. Good against a living menace is another. As he was speaking, a small telltale light on the far side of the hold had begun flashing. Chewbacca noticed it and called out to him. Solo glanced at the board, then informed his passengers. We're coming up on Alderaan. We should be slowing down shortly and going back under lightspeed. Come on, Chewie. Rising from the gambling table, the Wookiee followed his partner toward the cockpit. Luke watched them depart, but his mind wasn't on their imminent arrival at Alderaan. It was burning with something else, something that seemed to grow and mature at the back of his brain as he dwelt on it. You know, he murmured, I did feel something. I could almost see the outlines of the remote. He gestured at the hovering device around him. Kenobi's voice, when he replied, was solemn. Luke, you've taken the first step into a larger universe. Dozens of humming, buzzing instruments lent the freighter's cockpit the air of a busy hive. Solo and Chewbacca had their attention locked at the most vital of those instruments. Steady. Stand by, Chewie. Solo adjusted several manual compensators. Ready to go to sublight. Ready? All right, cut us in, Chewie. The Wookiee turned something on the console before him. At the same time, Solo pulled back on a comparatively large lever. Abruptly, the long streaks of Doppler-distorted starlight slowed to hyphen shapes, then finally to familiar bolts of fire. A gauge on the console registered to 0. Gigantic chunks of glowing stone appeared out of the nothingness, barely shunted aside by the ship's deflectors. The strain caused the Millenium Falcon to begin shuddering violently. What the? A thoroughly startled Solo muttered. Next to him, Chewbacca offered no comment of his own as he flipped off several controls and activated others. Only the fact that the cautious Solo always emerged from a superlight travel with his deflectors up, just in case of any unfriendly folks that might be waiting for him, had saved the freighter from instant destruction. Luke fought to keep his balance as he made his way into the cockpit. What's going on? We're back in normal space, Solo informed him, but we've come out in the middle of the worst asteroid storm I've ever seen. It's not on any of our charts. He peered hard at several indicators. According to the Galactic Atlas, our position is correct. Only one thing is missing. Alderaan. That just made me picture the galactic Rand McNally Atlas. How many pages must be in that thing? Missing? But that's crazy. I won't argue with you, the Corellian replied grimly. But look for yourself. He gestured out the port. I've triple-checked the coordinates, and there's nothing wrong with the nav computer. We ought to be standing out one planetary diameter from the surface. The planet's glow should be filling the cockpit, but there's nothing out there, nothing but debris. He paused. Judging from the level of the wild energy outside the amount of solid waste, I'd guess that Alderaan's been blown away totally. Destroyed? Luke whispered overwhelmed at the specter raised by such an unimaginable disaster. But how? The Empire, a voice declared firmly. Ben Kenobi had come in behind Luke, and his attention was held by the emptiness ahead, as well as the import behind it. No, Solo was shaking his head slowly. In his own way, even he was stunned by the enormity of what the old man was suggesting. The human agency had been responsible for the annihilation of an entire population of a planet itself? No, the entire Imperial fleet couldn't have done this. It would take 1,000 ships massing a lot more firepower than has ever existed. I wonder if we should get out of here, Luke was murmuring, trying to see around for rims of the port. If by some chance it was the Empire. I don't know what happened here, an angry Solo cursed, but I'll tell you one thing. The Empire isn't. Muffled alarms began humming loudly as synchronous light flashed on the control console. Solo bent to the appropriate instrumentation. Another ship, he announced. Can't judge the type yet. A survivor, maybe. Someone who ought to know what happened, Luke ventured hopefully. But Kenobi's next words shattered more than that hope. That's an Imperial fighter. Chewbacca suddenly gave an angry bark. A huge flower of destruction blossomed outside the port, battering the freighter violently. A tiny double-winged ball raced across the cockpit port. It followed us, Luke shouted. From Tatooine? It couldn't have, objected a disbelieving Solo. Not in hyperspace. Kenobi was studying the configuration, the tracking screen displayed. You're quite right, Han. It's a short-range TIE fighter. But where did it come from? The Corellian wanted to know. There are no Imperial bases near here. It couldn't have been a TIE job. You saw it pass. I know, it looks like a TIE fighter, but what about a base? It's leaving in a big hurry, Luke noted, studying the tracker. No matter where it's going, if it identifies us, we're in big trouble. Not if I can help it, Solo declared. Chewie, jam its transmission. Lay on a pursuit course. It would be best to let it go, Kenobi ventured thoughtfully. It's already too far out of range. Not for long. Several minutes followed, during which the cockpit was filled with a tense silence. All eyes were on the tracking screen in the viewport. At first, the Imperial freighter tried a complex, evasive course to no avail. The surprisingly maneuverable freighter hung tight on its tail, continuing to make up the distance between them. Seeing that he couldn't shake his pursuers, the fighter pilot had obviously opened up his tiny engine all the way. Ahead, one of the multitude of stars was becoming steadily brighter. Luke frowned. They were moving fast, but not nearly fast enough for any heavenly object to brighten so rapidly. Something here didn't make sense. Impossible for a fighter that small to be this deep in space on its own, Solo observed. It must have gotten lost, but it must have gotten lost, been part of a convoy or something, Luke hypothesized. I'm going to call it I'm going to keep going. There's only a page and a half more, but I've taken up my full hour. My Instagram feed just ended. Solo's comment was gleeful. Well, he won't be around long enough to tell anyone about us anyhow. We'll be on top of him in a minute or two. The star head continued to brighten, its glow evidently coming from within. It assumed a circular outline. He's heading for that small moon, Luke murmured. The Empire must have an outpost here, Solo admitted. Although, according to the Atlas, Alderaan had no moons. He shrugged it off. Galactic topography was never one of my best subjects. I'm only interested in worlds and moons with customers on them. But I think I can get him before he gets there. He's almost in range. They drew steadily near. Gradually, craters and mountains on the moon became visible, yet there was something extremely odd about them. The craters were far too regular in outline, the mountains far too vertical. Canyons and valleys impossibly straight and regularized. Nothing, as Capricus's volcanic action had formed those features. That's no moon, Kenobi breathed softly. That's a space station. But it's too big to be a space station, Solo objected. That size of it can't be artificial. It can't. I have a very strange feeling about this, was Luke's comment. Abruptly, the usually calm Kenobi was shouting. Turn the ship around. Let's get out of here. Yes, I think you're right, old man. Full reverse, Chewie. The Wookiee started adjusting controls, and the freighter seemed to slow, arcing around in a broad curve. The tiny fighter leaped instantly toward the monstrous station until it was swallowed up by its overpowering bulk. Chewbacca chattered something at Solo as the ship shook strained against unseen forces. Locking auxiliary power, Solo ordered. Gauges began to whine and protest, and by ones and twos, every instrument on the control panel console sequentially went berserk. Try as he might, Solo couldn't keep the surface of the gargantuan station from looming steadily, larger, larger, until it became the heavens. Luke stared wildly at secondary installations, as big mountains dish antennae larger than Mos Eisley. Why are we still moving toward it? Too late, Kenobi whispered softly. A glance at Solo confirmed his concern. We're caught in a tractor beam, strongest one I ever saw. It's dragging us in, the pilot muttered. You mean there's nothing you can do? Luke asked, feeling unbelievably helpless. Solo studied the overload sensor readouts and shook his head. Not against this kind of power. I'm on full power myself, kid, and it's not shifting out of our course. A fraction of a degree. It's no use. I'm going to have to shut down or we'll melt our engines. But they're not going to suck me up like so much dust without a fight. He started to vacate the pilot's chair, but was restrained by an aged yet powerful hand on his shoulder. An expression of concern was the old man's face, and yet a suggestion of something somewhat less funereal. For real. It's a fight you cannot win. Well, my boy, there are always alternatives to fighting. The true size of the battle station became apparent as the freighter was pulled closer and closer. Running around the station's equator was an artificial cluster of metal mountains, docking ports, and stretching beckoning figures nearly 2 kilometers above the surface. Now, only a minuscule speck against the gray bulk of the station, the Millenium Falcon was sucked toward one of those steel pseudopods, and finally swallowed by it. A lake of metal closed off the entryway, and the freighter vanished as if it had never existed. All right, friends. Looks like I've actually gone over my time today. So I guess that's as good a time as any to say good night, and I will see you tomorrow. Thanks again.